Welcome to Talk News at 9.
Yes, today we will be discussing about the upcoming Sochi 2014 Winter Olympic Games.
Yes. Though there has been quite an uproar about Sochi being the most expensive Olympics ever held, there's also been some controversial debates on Russia's bill that was passed on June 2013.
Yes, the bill that allows police officers to arrest homosexuals for gay propaganda targeted at the Russian gay youth and tourists. Many Western countries ponder on the safety of homosexual athletes or athletes who support the LGBT movement at the 2014 Winter Olympics. Many countries are considering boycotting the Olympics to protest against the bill. Russian government officials have announced that the anti-gay bill will be ineffective for the duration of the Games to respect the diverse nature of the Games as well as to honor the athletes participating. However, this does not stop the disputes between the nations of matters relating to the spread of homosexual propaganda.
So, to exactly what extent should the effects of cultural views influence our outlook on the LGBT community? Well, in order to answer this question, we must take a look at the areas of knowledge and the ways of knowing.
Through the areas of knowledge, we will be looking at the history and the ethics of the effects of cultural views and how they influence our outlook on the LGBT community. Most countries have accepted the LGBT community, however, this progression took many decades, and it is still a work in progress. The question is, to what extent can the evolution of cultural views impact the views on homosexuality? We will be comparing the history of the Olympics, the United States of America, one of the many countries that have grown to accept different sexual orientations, and Russia.
During the early Olympics, many sports organizations never recognized or accepted the LGBT athletes because homosexuality was not accepted in many cultures. In 1936, the earliest identified gay Olympian was Otto Peltzer. He was arrested in 1935 for sexuality because during that time, the laws against homosexuality were strongly enforced. He was released 2 days before the Berlin Winter Olympics and was only arrested multiple times after that. In 1956, Ronnie Robertson was the first positively recognized gay Olympian, mainly due to his outstanding results at his winter ice skating competitions and his acting career. In the 1960s, gender testing was introduced. The International Olympic Committee, IOC, enforced gender testing in order to separate between the males and the females based on their genetics. Several problems occurred through this process. Some of the females were identified as males either because of gene defects or the intake of performance-enhancing drugs. This resulted in prohibiting some of the athletes from participating if they had taken performance-enhancing drugs. The first athlete to be banned was Erika Schnitznigger, who failed the gender testing test. He later retired from sports and became a transgender. In 2004 Athens Olympics, the first proper rules towards transgender athletes were made. The gender of the athlete at birth will not play a factor in determining their current gender if a transition was made. Around this time, society has slowly adapted to accepting the LGBT community, to which the media has proudly recognized some of their contributions. In the 2010 Vancouver Winter Games, several pride houses were established, a center for the LGBT community, both athletes and supporters. This created more gay-friendly games. Fast forward to 2014 Sochi Winter Olympic Games, where many LGBT athletes believe that by prohibiting gay propaganda is a step backwards from this progression and acceptance of different sexual orientation.
Now we'll take a look at the history of LGBT within the United States of America. Homosexuality was not accepted openly or addressed by the nation until 1924, when the first gay rights organization was formed in Chicago, called the Society of Human Rights. The formation of this organization was not taken seriously by the public at first. It was not until 1950, post-World War II, that the United States Department of State identified homosexual relationships as high-security risks. Employers were given the right to terminate or refuse to provide employment to anyone identifying themselves as a homosexual or transgender. In 1951, the Madison Society became the first national gay rights organization, the starting point of a huge cultural change that was about to begin. 10 years later, in 1962, Illinois becomes the first state to decriminalize homosexual acts between consenting adults within their own privacy. Another 10 years later, in 1973, The American Psychiatric Society removed homosexuality from its list of mental disorders. This was a turning point for the homosexual community because it changed the connotation and the view of homosexuality as an illness into a more socially acceptable occurrence. In 1976, San Francisco Mayor George Moscone appoints Harvey Milk to the Board of Permit Appeals, making Milk the first openly gay city commissioner in the United States. Moscone was forced to fire Milk from the Board of Permit Appeals after just 5 weeks due to public controversy over his sexual orientation. After this, Milk co-founded the San Francisco Gay Democratic Club after his election loss. 2 years later, on January 8, 1978, Harvey Milk was sworn in as a member of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, winning the election by 30%. He began his term by sponsoring a civil rights bill that outlaws sexual orientation discrimination. Only one supervisor voted against it. Unfortunately, a few months later, Harvey Milk was assassinated by a fellow supervisor, Dan White. In October of 1979, a national march for lesbian and gay rights was held in Washington, D.C. It became the largest political gathering in support of LGBT rights to this day, with approximately 75,000 participants. In 1982, Wisconsin becomes the first state to outlaw discrimination on the bias of sexual orientation, followed by the city of Berkeley, California in 1984 for enabling employees domestic partnership benefits. Fast forwarding 10 years later, in 1993, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy instituted for the U.S. military permitted homosexuals to serve in the Army, but banning homosexual activity. Due to this, 900,000 people participated in the March on Washington for lesbian, gay, and bisexual equal rights and liberation. In 2000, Vermont becomes the first ever state to legally recognize civil unions between gay and lesbian couples. Fast forwarding between the years of 2003 to 2007, Connecticut and New Jersey all legalized civil unions. Massachusetts becomes the first state to legalize same-sex marriage. In 2008, New York, Oregon, District of Columbia, Washington, and Maryland legalized gay marriage. Government officials such as Joe Biden, Arne Duncan, and Tammy Baldwin come out to support gay rights and marriage. And then a few months later, Jason Collins of the NBA's Washington Wizards openly comes out as gay in an essay published in Sports Illustrated, stating that I am black and I am gay, and what I want is to continue to play basketball. I still love the game and I still have something to offer. He is the first active athlete in the NBA, NFL, or NHL to make a public statement over his sexual orientation. In 2003, Rhode Island, Delaware, Minnesota, New Jersey, Illinois, and Hawaii follow suit in legally recognizing same-sex marriages. Through this, we can see that within the last century, the U.S. culture has become more accepting of the LGBT community.
Now let's move on to Russia. In 1922, under Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, LGBTs were arrested and sent to prison camps, and is considered to be the equivalent to pedophilia. In 1953, under Nikita Khrushchev, consented sex between adult homosexuals were banned because of the fear that this sin would spread to the general public. Fast forward to 1993, as a result of strong foreign influence, homosexual acts between adults was legalized. However, those who were religiously inclined became irritated with the LGBT influence. In 2006, Russia had its first Pride. Protesters were arrested and beaten. The nation had a strong religious and cultural beliefs against the LGBT community and felt uncomfortable towards homosexual propaganda. In 2013, a bill was passed to eliminate gay propaganda, which, as a result, outraged many Olympians around the world who will be participating in the upcoming 2014 Sochi Games. As you can tell, there hasn't been much progression in accepting homosexuality. Even during the recent years, where other countries have adapted to different sexual orientations, homosexuality is still frowned upon in the Russian public, and there has been many cases where those who are publicly out have been beaten, tortured, and even killed.
Now let's move on to ethics.
Well, since the Olympics are held in Russia, I personally think that outside tourists and athletes should pay their respect to Russia's cultural customs.
So to what extent should the tourists and the athletes respect Russia's cultural customs?
Well, a large portion of Russian culture is based around their religious beliefs. The exposure of outside influence should not alter their customs.
That is true. However, the same also applies vice versa. Russia's culture should not alter the customs of other participating nations by using aggressive methods of reinforcing Russian beliefs, especially beliefs that are disagreed among the other nations. This only shows their negligence and lack of respect to the other cultures. In addition, Russia is also neglecting the purpose of the Olympic Games, which is to unite the vast and different nations together through a wide range of competitive activities. However, with the controversy of the Sochi 2014 Winter Olympics, it could serve just the opposite, as it may cause a separation within the relationship between Russia and other nations. Also, on the other end, many athletes have put their time and effort into their training for this event, and to discriminate against their sexual orientation, a factor that is not relevant to their athletic ability, and to potentially prevent them from participating in the games, is neglecting the rights and safety of the athletes themselves.
Yes, I also agree with you. Now we'll be moving on to the ways of knowing. To determine how we know, we'll be looking at perception, emotion, and reasoning.
Perception is how we interpret the things we see and how we process this information. We learn from the environment that we are exposed or subjected to. Russia's culture, both in history and in recent times, has been very Orthodox Christian-oriented. Their beliefs and religion form the base of their culture, influencing their ways of thinking. Younger generations are brought up in mostly Orthodox Christian households, constricting them to the religion they are exposed to. Thus, they must follow the ideals and rules of their culture. They must maintain the social norm that the government has enforced onto the nation, a religion that has been practiced throughout their history. In Russia, children that witness any form of discrimination will grow to believe that this behavior is acceptable both in the community and within the world, and that those who are being discriminated against are the people that they should grow to hate or fear. The way we view the world is not independent on oneself. We learn from what we see.
Now on to emotion and reasoning. Emotions affect our way of reasoning. They create a threshold to how we accept knowledge. We associate different situations with different emotions. Nations around the world have different opinions regarding a social controversy. In order to examine different emotions and reasons, we will have to look at the perspectives of the two main sides: Russians against LGBT rights and the nations participating in the Winter Olympics that support the LGBT movement.
Russians against LGBT rights. Orthodox Christianity states that Orthodox Christians do not outwardly address sex as an act. Instead, it is a private union between a man, a woman, and God. According to Genesis in the Bible, God created Adam and Eve, also known as man and woman. Men and women are instruments of creation. Male and females possess sexual reproductive organs used to give life to God's children. Thus, sex should only be between a man and woman to fulfill God's wishes. From a Russian's perspective against LGBT rights, this results in fear and disgust towards homosexuality. Hence, Russian authorities fear that the spread of homosexual propaganda from other nations and their own will leave a negative influence or impression on the Russian public. They believe that solutions such as the Olympic Pride House will contradict the foundations of public morality and the government policy in the area of protection of the family, motherhood, and childhood. Vitaly Mutko, the Minister of Sports of Russia, tells the public that the law is not meant to punish gays or lesbians, but rather the propaganda behind it. In addition, Russian government fears that propaganda of homosexuality will further inhibit the declining population and birth rate, as well as cause an increase in divorces.
Now let's take a look from the other perspective, nations participating in the 2014 Olympics that support the LGBT movement. Other nations have adopted and accepted homosexuality as a part of their culture. As a result of this progression towards acceptance, to demote the LGBT community, once again, is a step backwards. Hence, people feel uneasy and angry. Why? Because of the potential threat to the many athletes who participate in the LGBT movement. Since the Winter Olympics in Vancouver 2010, the LGBT community is becoming more recognized and accepted in many major sporting events. Nations and athletes worry that this law could reverse the progress and work that has been brought to them to this point today. Many of the inhabitants in these nations are against Russia's methods of reducing the exposure of homosexuality, and according to the UK Guardian, 56% of their readers support the US in boycotting the Olympics. However, despite the disapproval of this law, athletes do not want nor plan to withdraw themselves from participating in the Games. Many have practiced and trained for years for this particular moment. Much effort, time, and motivation has been dedicated for this event. As well, some athletes are also more compelled to attend the Olympics to act as advocates against the bill.
Of course, this is not the only example of disputes between cultural views. Let's take a look at Mitt Romney's presidential campaign in early 2013. In the Mitt Romney campaign, his personal view is that same-sex marriage should not exist, but he also believes that homosexual relationships should not be discriminated against. He believes marriage is between a man and woman, and that same-sex marriages do not deserve to have the same rights or benefits as heterosexual marriages. There's a fine line between politics and personal views. Yet through reasoning, we can see that political views and personal views are similarly related. Reasoning can be influenced by perception, what we understand to be true and what we know to be true. Mitt Romney believes in his faith and personal views, and he knows that homosexuals deserve their right just as much as any citizen. However, he contradicts himself when he says that he can separate his own personal views from his political views, suggesting that there is a difference or that one doesn't affect the other. We know that there's a fine line between knowledge and belief, but if individuals believe his faith to be fact, there's no way to guarantee that Romney's words hold any truth. Throughout his campaign against Barack Obama, Romney has received many negative responses from the supporters of Obama, such as many famous celebrities. Singer and Oscar winner Cher took to Twitter to advertise her disdain over Romney's campaign ideals, stating that he is sexist and anti-woman.
Another example is a 23-year-old transgender model, Jenna Talakova, disqualified from Miss Universe Canada pageant. Born male, Talakova identifies herself as a female since the age of 4. At the age of 14, she received hormone therapy. At the age of 19, she received gender reassignment surgery. Officials claim that she was disqualified for not providing accurate information on her application, not because of her sex change. However, it is stated that the model must be physically born as a female, though cosmetic surgeries are permitted. Since there doesn't seem to be a physical barrier in entering the pageant for a transgender, there must only be the conclusion that discrimination against homosexuality still exists and cultural influence of the past still lingers. As you can tell, though a large portion of the world has come to accept the LGBT community, problems regarding discrimination still exist.
Looking back to our initial knowledge question, to what extent should the effects of cultural views influence our outlook on the LGBT community? We can conclude that cultural respect should be paid from one nation to another. One belief should not be forcefully reinforced upon others. However, if the belief is against one's right and freedom, one should be given the opportunity to express the concern. In the case of Russia's laws against gay propaganda, they have enforced their cultural views among the tourists and athletes, not only neglecting the rights of the others, but as well as risking their safety.
It has been determined that the main distinction between Russia and countries that have accepted the LGBT community is the changes in the cultural customs. As shown in the evolution of American culture, the ideas of different sexual orientations are slowly adapted or were slowly adapted into its culture. Russia, on the other hand, presents very minimal changes in cultural and religious beliefs. However, though the discrimination has been reduced throughout the years in several countries, homophobia is not completely addressed. New problems still arises because homophobia that have been inherited from the past still remains.
And this concludes our daily talk news at 9.
Yes, next to come on primetime television, Keeping Up with the Kardashians. Good night.